Namaste. Namaste. Good evening, everyone. Johar. As we are all aware, IMCS, along with the UN and the rest of the world, marked and celebrated August 9th as the International Day of World Indigenous People. The theme for this year's celebration is Leaving No One Behind and the Call for a New Social Contract. IMCS Asia Pacific has set aside this month of August 2021 to augment our knowledge of the indigenous community, their culture, and the adversities faced by them. We are blessed to gather here now today for the launch of our Indigenous Peoples Youth Commission and webinar on the theme mentioned earlier. We now commence our program with an Indigenous ceremonial blessing led by Ms. Lori Victor, Indigenous People Education Coordinator of Department of Education, Philippines, and Father Jojo Fung SJ, International Chaplain of IMCS Pax Romana. Over to you, Father and Ma'am.
Okay, Lori.
So good evening to everyone. And again, thank you for this opportunity to be with all of you in this important occasion today. Before we move into our prayer ritual, I would like to request, to request all those who had an opportunity to bring soil and water to at least have it ready in front of them. And as we go through the prayer ritual, there will be an opportunity for all of us to call the participation of our ancestors, and you will see this, and I will mention it as we go along. Also, at some point in the prayer ritual, there will be a moment where we will take time to feel the earth and water in the palm of our hands as a way of remembering our connectedness to the earth. So please follow with us. Please follow as we go through the prayer ritual. So at this point, may I please share my screen?
Yes, ma'am.
So does everyone see the black screen?
Yes.
So now we will start. Let us begin our communal prayer by remembering the journey of the international movement of Catholic students through its first century, starting as a germinating organization in 1921. We reverentially request the ancestors of your organization, the founding generations, including Pope Paul VI, and the ancestors of the Catholic Church, including Mary, the Mother of the Church, to be with us in remembering. We recognize the continuing journey for justice for all peoples, including the indigenous cultural communities of the world, who have for centuries persevered in faith. We reverentially request the ancestors of our indigenous cultural communities and our ancestors, for those who belong to other ethnicities, to be with us this moment. Please unmute your mic and please mention the ethnicity or the indigenous group that you belong to. Kanaay,
Saya.
Sinhalese community.
Hongenchu.
Tamang.
Gole community.
Gurung.
Galegura.
Sika.
Garo.
Bangali.
Paharia.
through the centuries, our indigenous cultural communities have witnessed the growing destruction of our planetary home, including their ancestral domains. Our ancestors, elders, and community leaders have raised their voices and moved in faith, calling on all nations and peoples to remember our connectedness and reverential relations with all of creation. Today, in its 100th year, the International Movement of Catholic Students renews its commitment to justice and peace, not only within the human family, but with all of creation by germinating the Indigenous Peoples Youth Commission. With the ancestors of the Catholic Church, IMCS, and our indigenous communities, let us pray together with the words of Isaiah that this new commission be blessed. Together, let us read, "For as the earth brings forth its growth, and as the garden makes seeds spring up, so will the Lord Yahweh make justice and praise spring up in the sight of all nations." At this point, let us feel the earth in our palms. I request for those who are able to bring soil, please put it in our palm. Let us nourish it with drops of water. And remember that earth and water have given life to the plant and animal worlds and our communities and peoples through the millennia. As we feel the earth in our palm, let us remember our ancestors and what they have always said in different languages and ways. From the earth we have arisen, and to the earth we shall return. Let us pray together our intentions for the commission. Father Jojo.
Father, you are muted.
Okay. I'm not able to see the prayer. We pray that the Indigenous Peoples Youth Commission be always rooted in the soil of culture and faith of Indigenous peoples, communities, and water by the word of God. We pray.
Together, the Lord make justice and praise spring up in the sight of all nations.
We cannot see the response, yeah.
The Lord make justice and praise spring up in the sight of all nations.
Father,
Yeah, I need to see the prayer. Okay. Oh no. Sorry. We pray that the Indigenous People Youth Commission become a home for all young Indigenous Christians, for the nurturing of Indigenous faith and wisdom written in their hearts, especially in our Catholic tradition. We pray.
The Lord
together,
make
the Lord make justice and praise spring up in the sight of all nations.
We pray that the Indigenous Peoples Youth Commission stand in solidarity with Indigenous cultural communities together. The Catholic Church and Indigenous cultural communities witness and protect the sanctity of life and all presence in all of creation.
The Lord make justice and
Justice and prayer in the sight of all nations.
As we witness and actively take part in the germination and growth of the Indigenous Peoples Youth Commission of the International Movement of Catholic Students, we keep in our hearts the prayer of Isaiah. Together, let us pray. For as the earth brings forth
and as the
garden makes seeds
spring up.
so
the
will
Lord
the
So
Lord
will
will
the
the
Lord
Lord
Yahweh make justice and praise
spring up in the sight
in the
of
sight
all
of all nations.
nations.
Father,
I can't see the prayer.
it's for the blessing, Father, the ending blessing.
So let's close our eyes for the blessings of the ancestors together with Mother Mary, whose feast of the Assumption we celebrate today, with all the saints and the angels, with Jesus, our risen Lord. May this company bless us abundantly, especially as we celebrate World Indigenous Peoples' Day, in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Thank you, Ms. Lori Victor and Father Jojo. We are very fortunate to have partaken in this novel and invigorating blessing. I now invite Ms. Binota Tamang from Nepal to welcome all gathered here. And welcome all gathered here. Ms. Mirita, over to you.
Thank you, Abhijit. Distinguished facilitators, respected animators, seniors, and my dear friends. Lasso Fiapula, Namaste, and good evening. As we commemorate the commencement of important campaign, on behalf of IMCS Asia Pacific and Indigenous Peoples Youth Commission, I wish to pay my respects to all the Indigenous people around the world. I also acknowledge that in many countries, COVID-19 is posing a particular threat to their health and well-being. It is critical that the global community work to mitigate the pandemic's impact on Indigenous people. On 9th of August, the International Day of the World's Indigenous People is observed each year to promote and protect the rights of the world's Indigenous population. It was first pronounced by the General Assembly of the United Nations in December 1994, marking the day of the first meeting of the UN Working Group on Indigenous Populations of the subcommission on the promotion and protection of human rights in 1982. The month-long campaign initiated by IMCS Asia Pacific and Indigenous Peoples Youth Commission believes to recognize the achievements and contributions that Indigenous people have made to improve world issues such as environmental protection. And at the same time, we are together in this to encourage one another in the promotion and protection of the culture and rights of Indigenous people. So, on behalf of IMCS Asia Pacific and Indigenous Peoples Youth Commission, it is my great pleasure to welcome our speaker, Mr. Binota Dhamai, members of IMCS Pax Romana and Asia Indigenous Youth Platform, and all the like-minded people around the globe. Let us join our hands together and contribute to our society. Thank you, and hope you all will enjoy the exciting sessions ahead.
Thank you, Ms. Binota Tamang, for your warm words. Next, I invite Mr. Ravi Tisera, International President of IMCS Pax Romana, for the presentation of the IMCS Indigenous People Youth Commission, as well as to introduce the IPYC Commission newly installed members. Over to you, Mr. Ravi.
Thank you, Abhijit. It's such a great pleasure to get connected with all of you in this auspicious moment where we are establishing the officially establishing the IMCS Pax Romana Indigenous Peoples Youth Commission. So yes, and I yes. So as we are establishing this commission today, give me a second. Sorry. So yeah, as we are establishing this commission today, that I would like to share about the vision and the mission of this commission, because this Indigenous Peoples Commission work that even though we did not have a commission before, we have been engaging in indigenous activism since the foundation of the organization in the past 100 years, I would say, all around the world. So finally, we are establishing official space where the indigenous and non-indigenous youth can come together and continue this mission that we have already been doing as a part of our commitment to the society. So if I briefly share the vision of this commission is, IMCS Pax Romana Indigenous Peoples Youth Commission envisions an inclusive and green world where indigenous youth play a leading role in achieving their own future and full recognition for their rights, peace and justice, respect, equality, development, indigenous spirituality, and dynamic culture. Because the global movement where the Catholic, international Catholic tertiary students are coming together has been always in a space where we work together and together with the marginalized communities, and also like not for the marginalized communities, directly by the marginalized communities, so the youth directly doing things for themselves. This space is not a space where we are doing things for the commission, for the indigenous community. This is a space for the indigenous community to do things for themselves using the global platform that we already have established. So that is where this vision that I shared with you is quite applicable and quite relevant to this very current moment. And the objectives of this commission would be, we have we will expand this obviously on the way, but for the moment we have recognized certain clear objectives to build capacities of indigenous student leaders, ensuring full and effective participation of indigenous youth at all levels of decision making, collaborate with indigenous youth to engage with local, national, regional, and international processes, as well as relevant organizations and agencies at all levels, ensure strengthening of movement, networking, and collaboration with other organizations for the implementation of indigenous rights. So these are the really recognized objectives of the Indigenous Peoples Youth Commission, as we say, the objectives of this space that we have created. So, and last but not least, that I want to thank all the people who have given their labor to establish this space, take this initiative, because we have been really trying to establish this space as long as I remember, because without the support or without the direct engagement of the indigenous student leaders, it is just a dream. It is not a reality. Because only a student, indigenous student leader, or the other indigenous student, other members of the indigenous community who has done this, the engagement before, can give this initiative meaningfully. So I thank all the IMCS indigenous student leaders who took this initiative to establish this commission, who connected all this other actors who are already doing the engagement with the community. So I give you the credit, my dear indigenous student leaders of IMCS Pax Romana, for taking this initiative. And and sorry, and we have our partners who are giving us the indigenous wisdom and the expertise to establish and to continue this mission. Especially our co-organizer of this webinar, Asia Indigenous Youth Platform of Asian Indigenous Peoples Pact. So I thank you, our members from the AIYP, Ms. Chandra Tripura and Mr. Binota Dhamai, and Ms. Norma from the Indigenous Community Elder from Philippines, and Ms. Laurie Victor, Indigenous Community Leader from Philippines. So thank you all of you for facilitating and supporting this initiative as the co-sponsors, and also as the, how do you say, well, I will, according to the indigenous terms that I'm trying to learn, elders of this commission. So thank you all of you, and especially the Mr. Binota Moi Dhamai, the co-chair of United Nations Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous People. I welcome you to the session, and also I'm very grateful that you have agreed to support this initiative and give your wisdom and expertise to this budding initiative of the IMCS Pax Romana. So without further ado, I will pass this to back to Mr. Abhijit. Welcome all of you. I felt quite grateful as a non-indigenous person when Laurie Victor welcomed and recognized the non-indigenous students to this indigenous space, this sacred indigenous space. So Ayubowan, and thank you for welcoming us all to this space. Let's continue our mission. Thank you, Abhijit.
Thank you, Mr. Ravi. It was lovely hearing from you. Thank you for providing us the vision and mission of our IPYC commission, and also welcome all the newly elected members to the commission. We will have a great time working together. Now I move with utmost respect. I now welcome Ms. Norma Gonos, Director of Aguila and former member of the National Council of Indigenous People, Philippines, to officially launch the IMCS Indigenous Peoples Youth Commission. Over to you, Ms. Norma.
Good evening, everyone. To our honored guests, the Vice Chair of EMRIP, Mr. Binota Moi Dhamai, Ms. Chandra Tripura of AIPP, my fellow Filipino IP Laurie Victor, Father Jujo, Mr. Ravi, everyone, all members of Asia Youth Platform present tonight, youths around the world, madayudo na pagpagipaso, pagpaging balay. I wish you warm welcome in this peaceful and wonderful evening. Born and raised as an IP, I became an advocate of IP rights in my entire life. 10 years ago, when my only child was just 11 years old, she asked me, is there any other advocacies or concern that you know aside from indigenous peoples? I said, why? She answered, because I have never seen you engaged in other issues other than that of the indigenous peoples. I said, but who is going to do this if not of us? If not the people who understands us, whether they are IPs or not. And she said, but I don't want to work with you because you're all alone. I see no one joining you. That was my turning point, and right there I saw the disconnect. The disconnect of the elders leading the youth and journeying, leaving them behind, engrossed in an education that is not even responsive to the culture and the way of the people. In my entire life as Indigenous person, I would say this is one of the very few moments or milestones that makes me feel so happy. Not because I feel honored to lead the launching, but more so because this evening, tonight is such a significant and historic milestone. And also because the youth or Indigenous youth around the world are coming here together from different races and different countries who, despite of different languages, they will begin to understand each other and stand together to make the world of Indigenous peoples whole and connected. As an elder, I feel honored to be with you tonight, and I salute each one of you to make tonight a special night as you will start looking for solutions for the common concerns and issues confronting the Indigenous communities, our home, that some of you have identified during the series of workshops that we have had last month. I know that challenges will be at hand. You are the future of our common home. So stay connected and develop sense of belongingness as you cultivate good values. I remember the inspiring lines of Bishop Claver. He was an SJ, Society of Jesus, from the Cordilleras in the Philippines. And I quote, "There are natives that are both grounded in their local culture and at the same time well-versed in the mainstream system. But not many of them right now is in our Indigenous communities. These are the people we should train and produce. But there is further problem. Those who gain education and skills somehow become corrupt. They destroy their own people. Now, how do you train them without making them corrupt? Definitely, we have to inculcate values. My hope, our hope is that the youth at the front line will become more united and connected for the future of this common home. There is a need and challenge for the youth around the globe to stand in solidarity in halting the enormous damages of the global crisis and problems such as, but not limited to, the crisis in climate, and now larger than that is the pandemic that we all suffered. But don't be afraid. Let us all join hands to the most and do the most challenging words, respond to these most challenging words. And what are they? The application, the execution, and the implementation and reflection. The relationship of these issues and concerns to our day-to-day life. Don't be cowed by those words. Why? Because we've done the first lap. That of the series of workshops conducted in preparation for the World's Indigenous Peoples Day. And we are able to reach at the end of the first lap, that of launching what we have reaped tonight and started our collaboration in coordination among all people present tonight, even before we are able to launch it. And we're going to do it in a few seconds from now. And so this is it. In reiteration of the high level of commitment to journey with you, I enjoin all people around, those of you who have heard this message, and recognizing that elders need to provide a bridge for connecting the edge. With honor and pride, I stand with you to formally launch at this very moment the International Movement of Catholic Students, Indigenous Peoples Youth Commission, and webinar on International Day of the World's Indigenous Peoples. So I enjoined everyone to say, "Help us, God." Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Norma, for your beautiful words of wisdom. Hopefully we'll work together much more in the future, and we are expecting our Indigenous Youth Commission members to also engage with you more in the upcoming future. Thank you. I now welcome Ms. Chandra Tripura, Executive Council Member of the Asia Indigenous People Pact, to deliver greetings from the Asia Indigenous Youth Platform. Over to you, Ms. Chandra Tripura.
Thank you, Abhijit. Good evening from the Chittagong Hill Tracts of Bangladesh. Warm greetings from Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact and Asia Indigenous Youth Platform. We're grateful to be a part of this amazing initiative, Indigenous Youth Commission, and we really like to thank IMCH for taking this initiative. I strongly believe that youth are the power bank, and youth hold the power to shift the dynamics of the world. If we want to change, we must provide leadership support for youth in making change possible. Indigenous youths in particular continue to face racism and discrimination, and also are marginalized in society. But when they have a sense of belonging and a strong cultural identity, they become more resilient, powerful individuals. They have immersed roots through their ancestral lineage, wisdom, and intelligence. They are the future leaders, but I believe, and I always say that Indigenous youths are the present, at the same time are the future leaders for their communities. And it is really critical to restore leadership from the erosion of their traditional knowledge, practices, and habitats, so that they can begin to create a more sustainable, independent system for the coming generations. And I hope that this Christian Indigenous Youth Commission will not just only work for the Christian Indigenous youths, but also will be the power bank of all Indigenous youths around the world. I'm not gonna say too much today.
I think there is some issue with Ms. Chandra's internet network. So we'll move on to the next. I would like to say that Asia Indigenous People Pact is organizing this webinar and the upcoming webinars too with IMCS Pax Romana. We are very grateful for their support they have been giving us to launch the IYPC Commission, and all of the support that they've been giving throughout to the International Movement of Catholic Students, Pax Romana. Thank you, Ms. Chandra, for joining us today. We now move on to the most awaited and anticipated session of the day. I cordially invite, with respect, Mr. Binota Dhamai, Vice Chair of United Nations Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous People. A little about Mr. Dhamai. Mr. Binota Dhamai has more than 15 years of experience in the Indigenous people's rights movement, network building, campaign, and advocacy in the national, Asia regional, and international forum. He is a member of the Juma Tripura tribe from Bangladesh, where he worked as a student leader. He has also led as coordinator for the Asia Indigenous Peoples Caucus from 2019 to 2014. To the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, and also on the UN Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous People of UN Human Rights Council. Mr. Dhamai is also serving as the member of AIYP Executive Council and a member of the Board of Trustee of UN Voluntary Fund for the indigenous people. I wholeheartedly welcome Mr. Dhamai to the floor to lead the webinar on the theme, Leaving No One Behind and the Call for a New Social Contract, which is also the theme taken by the United Nations to celebrate this year's Indigenous Peoples Day, World Indigenous Peoples Day. Over to you, Mr. Dhamai.
Thank you, moderator, for this introduction. I actually thought that you will keep very short about my introduction, just my name and the position of the EMRIP. But anyway, thank you so much for this introduction. Thank you. Kolumka, greetings. Good afternoon, good evening, and also good morning, those who are in the morning time, because it is virtually and time zone is quite different. So at the outside, I'd like to congratulate the members of the International Movement of Catholic Students Indigenous Peoples Youth Commission. This formation means a recognition and inclusion of indigenous peoples, which extends supporting the cause of indigenous people's rights and their movement. And I thank you for giving me this opportunity to be witness of your launching event. It's an honor and privilege. And I'd like to convey also a happy International Day of the World's Indigenous Peoples. As it is on the occasion of the International Day of the World's Indigenous Peoples, I'd like to pay my respect to the indigenous peoples, leaders, and activists who sacrificed their lives, dedications for the cause of their people's rights. And I also acknowledge those organizations who have been part of this journey of indigenous people's rights movement for their rights, dignity, and survival. And also I pay my respect to the elders of the past and the present. As I'm invited to this platform today, as a member of the EMRIP, I'd like to convey my message as what we do as EMRIP. First, I'd like to share EMRIP mandate and the work we do for the advancement of the indigenous people's rights. Secondly, I'll share my thoughts in my personal capacity on the theme of the International Day of the World Indigenous Peoples. And also I'd like to hear more from the audience, more interactive discussion, or to some extent the clarifications or open dialogue, how we actually can promote and advance indigenous people's rights in different levels. The mandate of the EMRIP is to provide the UN Human Rights Council with expertise and advice on the rights of indigenous peoples as set out in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And the mandate is also to assist member states and indigenous peoples in identifying the need for and providing technical advice regarding the development of domestic legislation and policies relating to the rights of indigenous peoples. Expert mechanism conducts studies to advance the promotion and protection of indigenous peoples' rights by clarifying the implications of key principles such as self-determination and free, prior, and informed consent. So by examining good practices and challenges in a broad array of areas pertaining to indigenous people's rights, and suggesting measures that states and others can adopt at the level of laws, policies, and programs. And EMRIP also has a country engagement mandate upon the request of the member states and indigenous people's organizations. As I mentioned at the beginning, that UNDRIP is the central of our mandate. The UNDRIP is a historic document built upon consensus between the state and indigenous peoples through the negotiation of 25 years. This declaration acknowledges indigenous people suffering from historic injustices as a result of colonization and dispositions of their lands, territories, and resources. This has also recognized the urgent need to respect and promote the inherent rights of indigenous peoples, which derive from their political, economic, and social structures, and from their cultures, spiritual traditions, histories, and philosophies, especially their rights to their lands, territories, and resources. This has also recognized the urgent need to respect and promote the rights of indigenous peoples affirmed in treaties, agreements, and other constructive arrangements with the states. All the rights of indigenous peoples enshrined in the declaration are indivisible, interdependent, and grounded in the overarching right to self-determination. The relationship between the International Day of the World's Indigenous Peoples, 9 August, and the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, one has to be seen its historical context. If we see the history of the International Day of the World's Indigenous Peoples, it is an outcome of the effective lobbying by indigenous peoples of the UN General Assembly to dedicate an international day to recognize indigenous peoples and their rights. The date 9 August was chosen to recognize the date of the first meeting of the UN Working Group on Indigenous Populations in 1982. The UN Working Group of Indigenous Populations was tasked with following up the review of the Jose Martinez Cobo study on indigenous peoples, which set out many dimensions of indigenous peoples' rights. The Working Group on Indigenous Population led to an International Year of Indigenous Peoples, the establishment of the position of a Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the UN Voluntary Fund for Indigenous Peoples, and the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. So this working group was also the genesis of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples that I have mentioned. The declaration resulted 25 years of hard work and diplomacy of indigenous activists and human rights defenders. Today, the EMRIP, as an expert body, advances the work that the UN Working Group on Indigenous Population began through conducting studies to advance the promotion and protection of indigenous people's rights, such as land rights, access to justice, culture, language, cross-border, and migration, to name a few. So this expert body is clarifying the interpretation of key rights in the UN Declaration, such as the right to self-determination and free, prior, informed consent, and examining the good practices and challenges that I mentioned earlier. We have also provided expert advice already to the UN member states, such as New Zealand, Finland, and also the Mexico City. Now, in terms of the point, my second point, the leaving no one behind indigenous peoples and the call for a new social contract, that the theme has provided for this year's celebration of the International Day of the World's Indigenous Peoples. It has to be seen also what we have achieved last 2 international decades of the indigenous peoples, and why the social contract has been emerged now as a critical point of issue to be addressed in different level, and also this International Day. You may aware that first International Decade of the World's Indigenous Peoples from 1995 to 2004, the main objective was to strengthening international cooperation for the solution of problems faced by indigenous peoples in such areas as human rights, the environment, development, education, and health. And therefore, the theme for the first decade was Indigenous Peoples Partnership in Action. However, while the first international decade achieved important institutional developments, but at the same time, it was revealed that indigenous peoples in many countries continue to be among the poorest and most marginalized. Also, the adoption of a declaration on the rights of indigenous peoples, one of the main objectives of the first decade, has not been achieved. Therefore, at the end of the first decade, it was realized that the further efforts are needed to ensure that all indigenous peoples everywhere enjoy full human rights and enjoy real and measurable improvements in their living conditions. As a result, there was a second international decade of the World Indigenous Peoples from 2005 to 2014. And that's adopted on 22nd December 2004, started from January 2005 and ended December 2014. And the objectives of the second international decade were to promote non-discrimination and inclusion of indigenous peoples in processes at all levels, to promote the full and effective participation of indigenous peoples in decision-making, redefine development policies that are culturally appropriate for indigenous peoples, adopt targeted policies programs for the development of indigenous peoples, develop strong monitoring mechanisms to improve the lives of indigenous peoples. So if in the second decade, we see one of major achievement of this decade was the adoption of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in 2007, which has become part of the mandate of the expert mechanism on the rights of indigenous peoples. But also if we see the impact of the second decade, through it was during the Millennium Development Goals, a substantial gap remained between the formal recognition of indigenous peoples and the implementation of policies on the ground. So practically have not much achieved in terms of the recognition and full enjoyment of human rights of indigenous peoples on the ground. So despite these two international decades dedication for indigenous peoples development, over the years we have been experiencing an alarming rate of human rights violations against indigenous peoples. Indigenous people voices have hardly heard. They were excluded from all the processes, including their socio-economic development issues. A genuine, effective, and meaningful participation at the decision-making level is still a challenge at the domestic level. After the second international decade on indigenous peoples, we have seen the global call for the post-2015 development agenda. And we know everyone, these sustainable development goals targeting 2030 to achieve with the slogan of no one left behind. So this year, the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues has decided the theme for the International Day of the World's Indigenous Peoples, leaving no one behind, indigenous peoples, and the call for a new social contract. This International Day is an occasion to educate the public on issues of concern, such as indigenous peoples, and to create positive political development and environment to mobilize political will and resources to address indigenous people's needs and aspirations, and to celebrate and reinforce achievements of humanity. My basic understanding the social contract is about the relationship of power between state and the citizen as a consensual exchange. The Permanent Forum lays out that a social contract is an unwritten agreement that societies make to cooperate for social and economic benefits. In many countries where indigenous peoples were driven from their lands, their cultures and languages, denigrated, and their people marginalized from political and economic activities, they were never included in the social contract to begin with. So the social contract was made among the dominant populations. Over recent years and decades, various societies have sought to address this, including through apologies, truth and reconciliation effort, legislative reforms, as well as constitutional reforms. So as I mentioned in the beginning, that the relationship of the International Day of the Indigenous Peoples and also the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, over the 25 years of lobby and advocacy, campaign and diplomacy. And that's how that even though we have these 2 decades for indigenous peoples development, we still see the less improvement in terms of the human rights, and also see the gross and systematic human rights violations, development aggressions, and assimilation policies towards indigenous peoples. So that's why the social contract proposed by the Permanent Forum is very timely, relevant, and very significant. This social contract is important despite a number of achievements can be noted from the last 2 international decades. But the fundamental needs for the safeguard of indigenous peoples has not adequately been addressed. Therefore, there is the call for this social contract. A commitment must be made from the government and mainstream community, mainstream society to ensure indigenous people's rights that are respected and recognized. I also see that this social contract provides opportunity to address historical injustice, impact of colonization, of assimilationist policies on the human rights of indigenous peoples, and disposition of their lands, territories, and resources. And this is also an opportunity that states meaningfully establish new relationships with indigenous peoples based on the recognition of their rights and on freedom from discrimination and wrongdoing. And this is also an opportunity to enhance harmonious and cooperative relations between the state and the indigenous peoples based on the principles of justice, democracy, respect for human rights, non-discrimination, and good faith. And I also say this is also an opportunity to recognize the urgent need to respect and promote the inherent rights of indigenous peoples, which derive from their political, economic, and social structures, and from their cultures, spiritual traditions, histories, and philosophies, especially indigenous people's rights to land, territories, and resources. But the question is now, how can we achieve this? One is that it depends on the political will from the state. Approaching the social contract for ensuring indigenous people's rights, I see the recognition to indigenous peoples as indigenous peoples is most important by the state. And it is a crucial first step for a new social contract. I believe that this will provide a space of setting moral and legal obligation towards establishing a relationship with indigenous peoples. The recognition, such as recognition of indigenous peoples claiming to their lands, the decolonization of education systems, judicial systems, and customary laws, which consider as an essential part of recognition. And to achievement, the political will also has to be shaped that the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as the main framework for the social contract. And framing the social contract of one must be addressed the colonialism, this long-term effects and overarching challenges with deep historical roots. And also this means that the social contract must recognize the right of indigenous peoples to self-determination, including free, prior, informed consent, and their rights to autonomy and political participation, and their judicial systems, customary laws, and also self-determination that I mentioned is the fundamental norm. Without the right to self-determination, none of the other rights to indigenous peoples can be fulfilled. As I mentioned earlier, that it is the overarching rights for indigenous peoples. Now to the exercise of the right to self-determination, in line with the UNDRIP Article 3, this explicitly refers to the autonomy and self-government. Self-government and autonomy are important constituent elements for the right to self-determination of indigenous peoples. What is important is to recognize in legislation indigenous peoples' own legal systems and institutions, normative and legal practices, the customs and traditions, and autonomous and governmental systems, and provide adequate funding and resources to support indigenous peoples in their pursuit of self-determination. So government as the representative of the state has the responsibility to address the needs and ensure the rights of indigenous peoples. And the needs, as I mentioned earlier, recognition of indigenous peoples, which is critical in and of itself, but is also instrumental to the fulfillment of collective and individual rights under international human rights instruments, including the right to self-determination, cultural rights, and the rights to land, territories, and resources. And also, secondly, the role of the international organizations, institutions, bodies, and agencies, including the United Nations. The intergovernmental agencies, academic institutions, civil society organizations, among others, are crucial to play roles in facilitating social contracts in line with the principles of the UNDRIP. Thirdly, government, UN bodies, and agencies, and other concerned international and national bodies and institutions at the domestic level needs to be considered a new social contract, which must be based on genuine participation and partnership that fosters equal opportunities and respect the rights, dignity, and freedoms of all. A genuine participation is the right to participate in decision-making on the issues affecting them. So that's how I see the social contract should be at the international level and domestic level in order to ensure indigenous people's rights and their recognitions, and also a respectful attitude towards the indigenous peoples. So I'll stop here now. I'm happy to take some questions and have an interactive dialogue. Thank you once again for having me today.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Dhamai. If I'm pretty sure that your words of wisdom has inspired some questions among the participants. If anyone wants to raise a query, please to unmute yourself and raise your question. Address it to Mr. Binota Dhamai. Is there any participant with a question?
May I ask?
Sure, please.
Okay, my question is, as a learner, or let's say as a beginner, or let's say as an indigenous young person, what should be our contribution in ensuring the rights of the indigenous commission, or what shall we do to fight for our rights? That are like, there are many rights given priorly to the indigenous community. So what shall we do to fight for our rights? That's my question.
Is there any other question? Okay, if there is no question, then let me respond the question, what should we do? As I mentioned in my presentation, that this is all about the political will. The political will basically comes from the member states, and from the member state case, like the states, government is the representative of the state. Now this is when it says the political will, then this is the government. They have to take this into consideration. Now, as an organization, what you can do or what I can do, this is basically, one is awareness raising through the education, campaign and advocacy in various level, approaching to the policymaker about the indigenous people rights and why it is important, or how should be indigenous people issues addressed, or their rights to be respected or recognized. So this is all about awareness raising, education, campaign, advocacy that we can do as a people organization, civil society, NGOs, human rights organization, or religious-based organizations, whatever it is. But at the end, this is actually to the hand of the government, and government is the representative of the state. So until unless government take these issues in a positive manner, in a constructive manner, and provide their space to indigenous peoples through their institutions, governance, their effective participations, meaningful participations in the process, cannot do anything. So this is all about the government political will. What we can do is we only can supply to the government that what we want and what we need to survive, and what we need to revitalize our culture, education, or protect our culture, education, languages, all this. So that's what I can respond from my position. Thank you.
Thank you, Binota. Can I
you so
have
much.
can I ask a question? Do you hear me? Well, obviously the space, the commissioner's space is mainly dedicated for the indigenous students to engage. But as the organization is catering to the non-indigenous students who are interested of supporting the indigenous causes, how do, as an activist who has been engaging in these spaces for quite a long time, what is your advice for the non-indigenous students who are willing to contribute to this space? How we should be supporting the without taking the spotlight of the indigenous students?
That's very good questions, and well, the space is, see, this is part of the collective force, the indigenous people issues at this moment we have to do. Why I'm saying this, the collective force? That's because the issue itself for indigenous peoples, it's a political issue. In many countries, they are not recognized as indigenous peoples. And in many countries, the mainstream populations, they even don't understand about the indigenous people's values. They don't understand, they have the lack of understanding indigenous people cultural system, their traditional practices or spiritual or rituality, all this and that. So now here is the important part, like you are as a regional or a global organizations, you have a diversified connection at various level. At the same time, you have that capacity to approach why indigenous people's rights are important. But for this region, this youth commission as an international movement can consider taking into this one of the core issues. This because the indigenous people is not limited to one country. Almost all the countries, even in the Asian countries, they exist, though they are not recognized as indigenous peoples. So when it comes to as organization yourself from the international perspective, it is also a support with the domestic organizations to uphold their advocacy activities, raising the voices at different levels. And you are also part of this tool then. You are also part of this tool and this part of this collaboration. That's how you can also build the indigenous people's, the issue of indigenous people's awareness raising, educating among yourself, or understanding why indigenous peoples. It could be one issue, like for example, why indigenous peoples, or who are indigenous peoples, why they are distinct from others, why their culture is important, why their language is important. When it comes to the existence, why this is related to their culture and tradition, their spirituality. When it comes for the existence, why this is related to the land, territories, and resources. So see, these all are the elements so important for the indigenous peoples. This is the needs to really protect, really need to raise this issue to various level at the national and international, and also reaching out to the policymaker to address the indigenous people's issues for their recognition and legal protection. So that's where I think how you as an international movement organization, the Youth Commission, can play this constructive role. And also one thing, through the educating yourself, even because there is still lack of understanding about the concept of indigenous people itself. And even it may raise the questions, why indigenous peoples? Why not indigenous people? You see, one is with S, another one is without S. So this is also the important fact for the indigenous peoples, right? Why we talk about the collective rights? Because when we talk about the peoples, that ensure our collective rights. And also, if you see the UN Charter itself, this start with the peoples, not the people. So that gives the consistency in indigenous peoples movement at the global level and also the approach at the national level. And that's where also you as an India, I think, as a youth organizations can really play the role approaching why indigenous people rights are important, their connection towards the land, territory, resources, spirituality, tradition, customs, culture, language, that all are interconnected for them, for their existence. So that's the basic point, how we can build up the approaches. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anyone else with a query?
Hello.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, I'm Monica Kisku from India. And so my question is that we as an indigenous people, okay, in many places we get reservation and there are many quotas reserved for us. So nowadays what happened, people also have an issue that yes, these people have seats reserved. So what should we do to like stop people from creating an issue? Like if it is there, the reservation seat is there, so that is for the benefit of the indigenous people. So like what can we do to stop this kind of issue?
That's where the social contract needs, that society needs to be understood very clearly why indigenous peoples need such facilities from the government. So when it comes to the quota system, there's also the responsibility of the government to provide the space to those who needs that support. Definitely there are the peoples who will criticize, and there will be everywhere. And I'm not surprised if also in India cases, if there is a people saying why should be a quota for indigenous peoples. But practically indigenous peoples, they are the really needing that special systems, special privileges in order to advance their education system, their social development, their economic development, their opportunities, in order to also compete with the mainstream societies. Because mainstream societies, they are the far advanced than the indigenous peoples. If you see, for example, as I mentioned, two issues like the first international decade of the indigenous peoples and the second international decade of the indigenous peoples. First international decade was focused about strengthening international communities, understanding indigenous people issues, and also bridging these to the ground, means at the national level. And second point is, then we had the second international decade, we saw Millennium Development Goals. Now, if I ask a question to every one of you, do you believe that these Millennium Development Goals really achieve the indigenous peoples on the ground, the remote areas? Until today, there are so many remote areas of indigenous people. There is no social facilities, no infrastructure development, no communication system, nothing else. Moreover, there are so many also these militarization activities over the indigenous land and territories, so called in the name of security, this and that. So now coming to the point of this privilege system, giving the opportunity in order to fight back with the mainstream society for their rights. So this is, of course, for some, mainly the mainstream community may raise the question for them. But on the other hand, this is also the coming to the social contract again. This is the point that need to be shared. Why indigenous peoples need support from the government, and why government also provided that space, because indigenous peoples are the most backward, marginalized, and poor of the poorest. Even until today, now we are talking about the sustainable development goals. We are talking about no one left behind. And this is already in the banner, in the signboard, in the slogan. But until today, look at the example for the COVID-19 cases. On the ground, there's facilities like this rationing system, the food facilities, or medical service, and the indigenous peoples getting the equal opportunities from the mainstream population. No, they are not. They are not getting. They are even ignored in many places. And also the discrimination is everywhere against the indigenous peoples. Like in Bangladesh or in India, we often heard like indigenous peoples are facing discrimination, racial discrimination, like what is called is the comments, racial comments in because we look different from the mainstream populations. So the racial comments are coming in various ways. I don't want to mention particularly, but this is very obvious that we face. And that's why we talk about the special measures, affirmative actions for particularly indigenous peoples. And that's where in some countries like India gave this quota system for the education, for the job, employment for the indigenous peoples. But of course, this is there also challenges from the mainstream population, because they have had a little understanding about the indigenous people situations. So that's why UN call for the social contract is actually to bridge this gap of understanding between the mainstream society and indigenous peoples, as well as the government or the state. So in order to stop all these kind of things, the first approach is coming that way, like awareness raising, again, educating, and also give the sense of why indigenous peoples need that. Thank you.
Hi, sir. This is Bhim Tamang from Nepal. In context of Nepal, the indigenous people have been identified, and there are around 59. And the Constitution of Nepal has also given a special right. And based on that Constitution, there is a Indigenous Commission has been formed. And there are the federations related to indigenous people. But those mechanisms are there, and there is of course a human rights commission to oversight the human rights issues of indigenous people. So as a youth, as you said earlier, like there should be a political will, because the countries are signatories of different international instruments and different conventions and different agendas set by UN and other agencies. So as a youth, like those mechanisms are there, but they are not functioning well. So how can we like pressurize those government mechanisms to take our issues to the international level? Like you said, there should be particularly a political will to raise the issues of national context to the international. So as a youth, like so how can we like make it happen so that our country can like take our issues to the next level, or the level where it is need to be? Thank you, sir. That's the question.
Thank you for the question. Youth is the futures. You know, they're the one who will be leading the nations in the future. in many ways. So I think it's not the time for showing the disappointment. This is a long process. It's a movement, it's a long process. So approaching to the government and also building a good understanding, it's also a long process. If, for example, Nepal case, the constitutional amendment, all these recognitions, it did not come in a day. It was a long movement. Some Nepal organizations, for example, Indigenous Nationalities, NEFIN, National Federation for Indigenous Nationalities, and there are some people's movement organizations. They have been in the movement for long, for the recognition and for this constitutional recognition and for these particular institutions, government bodies, this and that. So it is not the actually easy thing. It's a long process. And also, if I mentioned that the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples that we had in 2007 through the adoption of the UN General Assembly, it was 25 years of negotiation between the state and indigenous peoples. So this negotiation it was such a way that building the consensus between the government and indigenous peoples, agreeing the word by word, sentence by sentence of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And that was not so easy. Just give you an example, like only the Article 3, the right to self-determination that enshrined the UN Declaration, which is the similar language of the International Covenant of the Civil and Political Rights, and also the International Covenant on the Economic, Social, Cultural Rights, both Article 1, talking about the self-determination rights, and that's the same language, just put it separately for indigenous peoples in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And it took several years just to get a compromise position with the government. So this is always a challenging part for indigenous peoples. And now for the Nepal, the positive side, and also you can take this opportunity to approach the government in the future. Nepal is the only country in the Asia region who ratified ILO Convention 169 on indigenous and tribal peoples. Indigenous and tribal peoples. So your collective rights are here actually recognized. So then Nepal also recognized UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So do you have actually the strong legal base that you can advocate to the government or the political leaders, the politicians for the indigenous people rights, for their governance, or for their self-government, for the autonomy to exercise self-determination rights. That will be possible, perhaps not today, but the continuous approach, advocacy, negotiation might help you advancing or taking to that position after some time. And yeah, I'm telling you, it is always not that easy to really get the government on board or approach them. But this is the process we have to do, and you have to use the civil society platform as well. That's where also the social contract that civil society must be understood indigenous people's needs. And you also have the responsibility also to approach the civil society that they are clearly understanding what you need. So this is a process. So if you expect the United Nations will resolve this problem, remember, I'm telling you, UN is a club of the member states. UN is a club of the government. Everything decided it is the government, intergovernmental decision. So getting anything from the United Nations system on indigenous people issues, that's why it's always a through advocacy, negotiation, and it's a long process sometimes, not that easy. And now getting to the national level advocacy, That's also the almost similar process. We have to build the movement. Movement means connecting the diverse backgrounds, professional backgrounds to the cause of indigenous people's rights and connecting to the government. So that's what I can say now.
Thank you. Do we have any more queries?
Hello, good evening.
Yeah, go ahead, Elon.
I am Edward Lloyd from Philippines. So I would just like to ask, how can social contract become beneficial for indigenous people to have equal access into economic opportunities?
Thank you, Edward, for the questions. As I mentioned, my simple understanding is social contract is the relationship between the state and the citizen. Now, indigenous peoples is also part of the citizen of the country as a citizen within the sovereign state. So now, for the indigenous peoples, this equal access of economic activities, that's also the approach needs to come from the different grounds. Also, the willingness from the government side. But again, now, if we see the indigenous people's economy, I think the far most important is how we can protect our indigenous economic system in order to get, or in order to catch the equal level of mainstream economic system. This is the important thing I think we need to see. So our economy is basically based on our localities, our traditional system, or this and that. Now, the question is, though we have the rights and recognitions of our economic system on the ground, though we have enough space, our marketing system, our production marketing system on the ground, did the government provide us such space on the ground? Or if there is an indigenous governance system, are they really approachable on that? So all these are actually related to each other. So again, it comes with the recognition, political recognition for indigenous people. So when it comes to the recognition, then it gives you the space of your equality and opportunity. Until or unless you are non-recognized as indigenous peoples, then what platform that you can negotiate with the government? The foremost condition is that the recognition to get this space, to provide, to access that space. So this is a critical part I see, and here. Yeah, this is I think, for the economic opportunities, equal access of economic system. That's again, it's coming the political commitment, willingness, and at the same time, the recognition to indigenous peoples and their economic system. So that's what I can say. And other thing is actually what we observe in different countries in the Asia region, or mainly Asia region, I can say that there are to some extent recognized indigenous peoples, bodies and institutions by the government. But sometimes the challenge is that those institutions are running by their pocketmen, means government people. So government pick up their like-minded peoples, including indigenous peoples, and choose positions for those institutions. At the end, those institutions actually don't work for them. They work for their political party or for their own interest. So that's what we see in the biggest example in the Chittagong Hill Tracts region of Bangladesh. There are the institutions set up under the framework of the Chittagong Hill Tracts Accord in 1997. There is no election, so there are interim bodies. So most of those bodies are actually appointed by the government, their ruling party members. And now, because they are also opportunists, they have to maintain the relationship with the government. They don't go to the straightly what actually indigenous people needs. They rather contributes what government needs. So these are also the challenges when it comes, for example, for your economic opportunity as well. To what extent those bodies are, if you have, to what extent those bodies are actually friendly to create such a space of the equality. So this is the point. And also same thing goes to Nepal as well. To what extent those are involved are favorable for indigenous people's rights. Yeah, that's my response, Mr. Abhijit.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Dhamai. Is there any other query that we would have?
Yes, one question.
Okay, yeah, Aaron, go ahead.
All right. Brother Binota, that I would like to ask on the idea of indigeneity itself. Yeah, I'll give you a case in South Africa. The white Afrikaners are fighting for recognition of them being a white African tribe. So there's this whole politics of, and I feel that this is also a universal thing. It happens in other places of claiming indigenous, of being indigenous. What are your thoughts upon this? Thank you.
Thank you. That's in African context. Well, let me share my thing then. Even though there is a EMRIP member from Africa region, but what I understand for the indigenous peoples and our indigeneity issue. One is that your connection to the land, territories, and resources, your distinct culture, identity, language, definitely there. But the spirituality, rituality that you maintain, that you are colonized, dispossessed, and you are still under such situation. So this is what the characteristic provides under the study of Jose Martinez Cobo. There are a few characteristics, few points on the characteristics about this. One is also who has their own traditional governance system. As I mentioned, spiritual connection, ritual connection to the land, territories, and resources. Who has own education system. So I can't remember exactly to all those points, but definitely these are one of the core elements that you can see, identify yourself. So now when it comes to the white people, I don't know what South Asian constitution says about those who were original inhabitants in South Africa and who invaded to South Africa. So it also comes the points with that. Like, for example, indigenous peoples' land and territories in most countries are invaded or invaded, conquered, or occupied for the resource exploitation or this and that. So mainly the colonization. So most of the indigenous territories, if we see the historical fact is they are colonized by the European. So that's why we always say, and UNDRIP itself recognized that the historical injustice of this colonization process, the invasion, aggression, killing, murder, this and that. So now in the South African context, who are the victims of this invasion and aggression or the exploitation? I mean, who are the victims and who colonize? And who are the colonizer? So colonizer cannot be an indigenous peoples, because historically this is not the point, and historically it does not say that the colonizer will be the indigenous peoples. So I think you have to see from that perspective. But if you're interested, I can send you the study or the characteristic of the Martinez Cobo, what it said. But this is the issue: colonization, this invasion, conquer, or exploitations that causes unrepairable damages, genocide, killing, murder, what's not. So that's the point. So colonizer never be a indigenous.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Dhamai. I think we have our time constraints, so we won't be taking any more questions. Thank you, Mr. Binota Dhamai, for your sharing, your knowledge, your experience with the United Nations, your experience of having done advocacy at the local, regional, and even at the global scale. And yeah, we hear your call, we hear your challenge to work to make sure that the indigenous people and their culture is recognized, and the need to create advocacy, a multi-stakeholder advocacy that focuses especially on the political lawmakers and the political will of the United Nations and the other government and intergovernmental bodies. Yes, thank you for sharing all of your knowledge, much of what we could do in this one session. We are very grateful, and I'm pretty sure all of the participants have been inspired. I'm sure there are more questions there, but time we're moving on. Next, thank you, Mr. Dhamai. Next, I invite Ms. Binota Tamang to read the statement for the indigenous community issued by the IMCS Pax Romana as a representative of the Indigenous Peoples Youth Commission, the newly installed Indigenous Peoples Youth Commission of IMCS Pax Romana. So I invite Ms. Binota Tamang to read the statement.
Okay. Thank you, Avijit. Okay, I'll start now. IMCS Pax Romana Indigenous Peoples Youth Commission launched a statement, leaving no one behind, Indigenous peoples, and the call for a social contract. Spread over 90 countries worldwide, over 476 million Indigenous peoples have their own unique languages, knowledge systems, and beliefs, and possesses invaluable knowledge of practices for the sustainable management of natural resources, holding their diverse concepts of development based on their traditional values, visions, needs, and priorities. Marking the date of the inaugural session of the Working Group on Indigenous Populations at the United Nations in 1982, every 9th of August is set out by the international community to commemorate the International Day of the World's Indigenous Peoples. The recent times has taught us the impact of being together and helping each other in times of urgency. Hence, the theme of this year's commemoration, leaving no one behind, Indigenous peoples, and the call for a new social contract can be described as the perfect fit. For Indigenous peoples, poverty and gross inequities tend to generate intense social tensions and conflicts. Eradicating poverty in all its forms and dimensions and reducing inequality are at the heart of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. The whole society, not only governments, but also social activists, Indigenous peoples, women, academia, scientists, all have a role to play in building and redesigning a new social contract that serves the interest of we, the peoples, as per the preamble of the United Nations Charter. Thousands of indigenous peoples' communities are suffering and their existence is being threatened due to the capitalist mindset of national governments, despite their resilience and commitments for survival. Addressing these issues is an important part of fulfilling the 2030s agenda's pledge to leave no one behind. Since the foundation of IMCS Pax Romana before 100 years, movement was determined to work together in making the world a better place for everyone. We renew our commitment specifically to continue our Indigenous peoples' activism, advocacy, and engagement. We urge everyone to pay attention to the needs and yearnings of Indigenous peoples and their cries for self-determination and cultures, and build a bonding of social fraternity and love. Let us work together to make their lives safe and advance for betterment. Today, as IMCS Pax Romana, we stand with Indigenous peoples in revive, preserve, and sustain their resilience, and with concerted and plural voices that are loud, strong, and heard in many spheres spheres that they inhabit. We determine to strengthen the Indigenous Peoples Youth Commission of IMCS Pax Romana as an inclusive platform for students from Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities to extend solidarity to all Indigenous peoples communities around the globe and serve humanity with wisdom and courage. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Binota Tamang. It was wonderful to hear the statement of solidarity. If we will be sending the entire document, the full length document, via email to all the participants so that you can go through it. I would like to invite Mr. William Nokrek, Asia Pacific Region Coordinator of IMCS Pax Romana, to deliver the concluding remarks and the vote of thanks.
Thank you, Abhijit. Thank you for moderating our webinar. Before I closing message, sorry, I would like to request Mr. Binota Dhamai, Dada, if you have a last message to our young people and young generation as an elder and experienced person. Yes.
Thank you, William. Well, what to say in one well, this is the international movement of the youth, and as I mentioned in one point, youth, they are the future leader of the nations. So you must understand the needs of the peoples, and particularly for the peoples like indigenous peoples. And I think if we have this clear understanding as a youth, whatever community or whatever identity you are, if you really respect the human rights and the rights for the indigenous peoples with their culture, language, identity, which is core of their existence, then this is the, I think, most important part to have to bridge the gap between the mainstream societies and indigenous peoples. Why I'm saying this? In many countries, this is the core issues. Like mainstream societies have had a little understanding about the indigenous peoples, and this the youths, they are the future, and they can actually fill this gap through their knowledge, expertise, building the association, building the partnership, building the cooperation, building the friendship. And unless we don't do this, the so-called peace, justice, and human rights will never be achieved. And this is not only for the indigenous peoples, it is for everyone. So that's the also meaning of the social contract, that the society from different parts has to be understood clearly, the needs of the indigenous peoples, and they will be the one taking the lead for the indigenous people's rights recognition as well. So this process, who can do this is the only youth can actually take this role. And definitely after you, there will be another youth leadership. So I will say that you will be the future leader, and you have the biggest responsibility to that. And you see that perspective to approach for peace, justice, and human rights. I think once we can approach this and we can make understand to everyone, that means we are achieving a very peaceful human society. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, sir, for your wonderful message before we ending our webinar. So thanks a lot, everyone, for this wonderful moment, actually. So this moment has been a very proud moment for us, especially for me, being a member of the indigenous community. Actually, many years in IMCS, we were trying and discussing how to create a platform for the indigenous people. So I'm very grateful to the IMCS students, IMCS movement, national movement, who agree and support us to launch this platform for indigenous students, indigenous young people, young generation. So at the same time, thanks to those who have supported and helped me to organize and launching this Indigenous Commission and webinar. Yeah, thank you, everyone. And I'm very grateful to my IMCS team, our co-organizers, AIPP and AIYP, Father Jojo, our international chaplain, my regional team, Tortoise, my lay female chaplain, and Sister Jantana, my religious chaplain, and Mr. Johnson Kumar Joseph, my lay male chaplain, and my secretariat team, and Miss Lori Victor, who bless our this webinar, and IMCS Youth Indigenous Peoples Youth Commission, and Honorable Speaker, Mr. Binota Dhamai sir, and Ms. Chandra Tripura, Mr. Ravi Tishara, International President of IMCS, and my organizing team, and my advocacy team, who is preparing themselves to become a young advocate for our indigenous peoples and our young generation, and all the participants for joining us. Let us work together to make Indigenous people's lives safe and advance for the betterment. Yeah. Thank you all. And you are cordially invited to join our next webinar. Mr. Gam, Asian Indigenous Peoples Pact Secretary General, and Ms. Joan Carling, Indigenous activist, and Ms. Jenila Simbang from Malaysia, Member of Parliament. They will join and we will listen their story, all the dimension and marginalization, how to become an icon of Indigenous people's right in the world. So all are invited to join us our next webinar, 22nd August. We will share all the information registration link in our social media. Please try to follow our social media. Thank you all. Good night and have a nice day. Thank you. Thank you, Dada. Thank you so much.
You have a very good speaker for the 22nd. I think you should ask very right and political questions to them, particularly Gam, Joan, and Jenny Lasimba. These three are the current and former Secretary General of Asian Indigenous Peoples Pact. They led the Asia movement, Indigenous Peoples movement. And I think, yeah, I'm taking the opportunity to tell you, everyone should join and prepare your questions to ask them the social contract, the recognition issue, the future movement, how is the Indigenous people's situation even this Corona time, and also the SDG, Sustainable Development Goal process, and also political leadership process at the national level, and why Indigenous peoples needs to be political participation. I'm just suggesting you should prepare and should have a very good question from, to ask them. Do not miss it. Don't miss it. It is a good opportunity. Thank you once again.
Thank you, Dada. Okay, thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Do follow our social media pages. You will get all of the information in our Facebook and Instagram pages. We will also email you both the statement and all of the resources that we have on the Indigenous Commission very soon. So keep in touch. Hope to see all of you in the next webinar. And we are also doing our campaign for the Indigenous community in this month of August. So do join us for that. Do send content for that. We are looking forward to your active participation. Good day, good night, good evening, good morning, wherever you are. Hope to see all of you in the next webinar. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Maria. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.